Once upon a time, someone was getting very stressed out. All they wanted in life was a bit of peace and quiet. Some privacy would have been nice, but it wouldn't stop. Everywhere they went, they were being spied on. Drones delivering food in the sky, refrigerators spying on them. Even their once-loved toasters started scrutinizing their every move, judging them. As if burning a bagel was now a crime. Then, along came the AI, and the world went to shit.
Welcome back. This is episode 15 of The Lockdown, the Practical Privacy and Security podcast. Now in today's show, I'd like to talk about a Reddit post I saw recently about an individual basically wanting to give up on privacy, trading convenience just because it makes their life comfy, as they put it. I'm going to briefly talk about Windows 11 and then the social security number breach by national public data. I'm going to talk about that as well as what to do if you find your information in there. And then we'll end the show with some brief discussion on Windows 11 and a small utility that I've created to show those damn system tray icons. A few days ago, someone posted on Reddit, and I'm going to read this word for word, but the title they gave their post was "On the Brink of Giving Up." And this really sums up why I do this podcast. Let me read it to you. Hi everyone. Recently, I have been taking steps to de-Google. I started using Proton Mail, Proton Calendar, Proton Password Manager, Brave, LibreOffice. I thought of using Linux, but I think I don't know enough about it. Unfortunately, right now, I have a sort of privacy fatigue where I genuinely sometimes think, is this all worth it? I use a Samsung phone, Windows computer. They can track me whenever they want. Other than that, it's so comfy to use Google products. They sync so easily with everything. It's also hard to use LibreOffice as it's not stored in a way that I can access from a browser, phone, laptop like Google Docs, Google Calendar, Google Maps. Even the worst privacy invaders like Google Assistant is just attractive. Sorry for this rant. I think many here have similar experiences. What did you do not to give up? What should I do? Now, there's been various responses, and they're pretty much on the ball. Find the right balance was the top comment. But this is the point I've been trying to get across, is there are extreme privacy measures we could recommend to this person. Is you need to go on Graphene OS, self-host everything, and I'll talk more about that later in the show. So run Nextcloud, keep that away from the internet. You can sync across your devices with that. But they've already said that Linux is not their strong point. And for the more technical among us, this is fun. Setting up a server, running Nextcloud, even running backups to Backblaze, which is encrypted with Restic, and all of that stuff can be a hobby for many of us. But my tagline really is, privacy doesn't have to be all or nothing. And this is what concerns me. This individual may just give up for the convenience of everything Google offers. And yes, we need to strike a balance. But I think we need to take things more slowly as well. I was taking quite significant steps to protect my privacy while still using an iPhone for a long time. I still use Windows. In fact, I've just upgraded to Windows 11, which is a privacy nightmare. But there are things you can do to lock it down, hence the name of this podcast. One of those things I've mentioned before is Simple Wall by a developer called Henry++. I've mentioned it before, I'll add a link in the show notes, but it really is a great step in preventing all the outbound connections Microsoft makes to call home, as it were. Every process that tries to access the internet will alert me, and Simple Wall will ask me, do I want to allow or deny? Running Windows 11 Pro helps. BitLocker can be enabled, disabling of services. There's a lot you have to do. But at the end of the day, why do I run Windows 11? Because it's not just a comfy experience. Many of the apps I need for music production, for example, require either Windows or Mac. For example, Ableton Live. I know there are alternatives, but I've been using that for 15 years. So to switch to a different audio workstation or DAW is going to be a huge upheaval for me. And basically, it was going to prevent the creative process. back to this Reddit post, and perhaps this individual is listening to this. I would just look at what you've done so far to protect your privacy. Moving to Proton is an excellent move. For a very long time, I was using Fastmail for email, and some family members still do. Sure, it's not going to have all the privacy and security that Proton offers, but again, their threat model doesn't need it. The reason they moved off of Google is they would have ended up paying to have custom domain names anyway. And we all know the data Google harvest. In fact, just in the news recently, they've agreed to delete the data they collected from the incognito tab. Now, this is a private mode for Chrome, incognito, where it should not be saving any history. And they were collecting that. Just another reason why anyone would be using a Google product is just unfathomable. But I get it. It's convenient. So perhaps don't leave the Google ecosystem entirely. If you are one of those people that are still heavily invested with Google Docs and other things, then don't just delete your account. So I would use Proton for email. I would use Proton Pass or Bitwarden, something like that for your password manager. Use Proton Drive to sync your files if you don't want to self-host. And perhaps create a brand new Google account with an alias name and a random username for your email address, so nothing is going to identify you, and use that for Google Docs. Again, look at the threat model. What are you concerned about? Are you writing documents as a journalist that could end up landing you in jail? You know, look what happened with Julian Assange, and there's other journalists that have been targeted too. Or are you an everyday user that's using it to do your coursework at university, or just write the next screenplay that could be on Netflix? You can see these are going to be entirely different threat models. And then I would use privacy as your guiding principle when selecting new products or services. Keep a skeptical view on things. Adopt some critical thinking. Analyze the privacy policy. Look what other people are saying in the privacy community. Now, one suggestion I have seen many people mention time and time again is OnlyOffice. Go to onlyoffice.com, again, link in the show notes. I haven't used it, but it's basically an Office 365 replacement. It's open source, which you can see on GitHub. They say they're compliant with international security standards. There's encryption at rest, in transit, and end-to-end. There's secure access, monitoring tools. I'm just reading this from the website, and document permissions. Now, do your own due diligence. Personally, I don't use it because I don't have the need to work on documents online while I'm traveling, for example. I'm quite happy working in LibreOffice offline and just having that sync between my devices with Nextcloud. But if you need the convenience that Google Docs provides, give OnlyOffice a try. It's free for personal use. But I think more importantly than anything is just understanding what you want to do to protect your privacy and taking small steps to get there. Be skeptical. Use critical thinking. Just because someone, such as myself, recommends OnlyOffice, it might not mean it's fully private. It's open source, sure, but I haven't analysed the source code. Maybe it's calling home or sharing data to third parties that they don't talk about in their policy. Now, that's highly unlikely. In security, we must always assume a breach. That's one of the core premises of zero trust, which I often talk about as part of my day job. And we know breaches are happening every day. Organisations always put this saying in their privacy policies that they take the security and privacy of your personal data very seriously. Or even worse, when I see things like we adopt military-grade encryption. All of that is absolutely meaningless. And I'd like to distinguish between what we call cyber security and resilience. Cybersecurity, has been focused for decades on preventing breaches, preventing attacks, preventing threat actors from getting initial access into the environment, but it's happening on a daily basis. It's obviously not working. Just look at what we've done. In the 90s, early 2000s, we had firewalls, antivirus, and email filtering. That's what most organizations would adopt for their security, and that was it. But as things evolved, antivirus turned to next-gen antivirus, then endpoint detection and response, next-gen firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, analytics, machine learning to analyze log traffic and SIM logs. All of this stuff we need, but data breaches are still happening every single day. And I think organizations are now beginning to realize that they need to focus on resilience. Like, okay, a breach is going to happen. It's going to happen to us. They have to assume they have an intruder on the network. So what are they going to do to handle the breach? How can they stay resilient? How can they recover? And that's a big part of what I focus on in my day job is ransomware recovery. We must assume it's going to happen. Therefore, how can they recover the data without having to pay a ransom, for example? Cyber insurance may be part of it. And one area we haven't addressed properly as an industry are data breaches, the actual exfiltration of personal data. We've seen it with social security numbers, our credit reports, all the ingredients needed by scammers and fraudsters to steal our identity. So while cyber resilience helps organizations recover from an incident, I'm not sure we're doing enough to help the consumer recover from their personal data being leaked. And I guess that's why we are here, to mitigate the impact of when these privacy disasters happen. And unfortunately, we have to resort to measures such as using alias names and alternative addresses, knowing that our data is just going to get exposed. But when it comes to the US government, what can we do if our social security numbers are going to be leaked online? So let's talk more about that. If there were just two things I wish the United States would implement, it would be something along the lines of GDPR that's nationwide and a default credit freeze for every single resident of the United States. There is no reason whatsoever to have your credit unfrozen. Unless you're going to be taking out a mortgage or a loan, there is just no reason to have it left hanging open. That alone is such a simple step that the government could take. I have no idea why it's not required by law, federal law, that all credit agencies must freeze by default. Then, if someone wants to take out a mortgage, legitimately, they have to provide a PIN number and other identifying information to do a temporary lift on the freeze. Now, it's not going to get rid of all fraud. I get that. Criminals can still use publicly leaked data to lift the freeze. I'm sure that's already happened. But GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation of Europe, is desperately needed in the United States. And I think the reason why is rather than individual lawsuits going against companies such as the National Public Database and other entities that leak this information, a regulatory body could impose huge fines. Again, I don't think it's going to stop it. Data breaches still happen in Europe, but the security practices at many of these organisations is abysmal, to say the least. So who are National Public Data? Well, I'm going to read from the Wikipedia entry. I'll put a link in the show notes. And it's part of Jericho Pictures Incorporated. Apparently, they are a data broker that perform employee background checks. I don't know what that's got to do with pictures. It sounds like a movie studio. But anyway, it goes on to say their primary service is collecting information from public data sources, including criminal records, addresses, and employment history, and offering that information for sale. Now, if you go to nationalpublicdata.com, which is their website, they offer an XML API data service. And then the description says this: many different businesses use our service to obtain criminal records, background checks, and more, all via XML integration. So I suspect this was able to happen because of weak API security. I mentioned Twilio Authy in a previous episode, and it was weak API security that allowed that. Now, their website goes on to say, all our data is updated regularly. We guarantee freshness and quality. Search billions of records with instant results. And many searches are no hit, no fee. Our services are currently used by private investigators, consumer public record sites, human resources, staffing agencies, and more. Join now and enjoy quality data with low fees. That alone should be illegal. No private organisation should be allowed to sell PII, personally identifiable information. End of story. It should not happen. We really need GDPR in the United States. Now, you may be wondering, how do you go about checking if your information is in there? There are a couple of sites out there which I don't actually recommend. I'm going to mention them, but it's not something I would do. Now, the first one is NPD202401. What they ask for is first name, last name, and a zip code, or the social security number, or a phone number. Please don't enter your social security number or phone number to yet another site. They may say they're not storing this information, but it's still web server logs. Whether they use Apache, Nginx, I don't know what the web server is. And how do we know that whoever set up their infrastructure is talking to their security people and making sure that's not being logged? I just would not enter the information again. There is another site called npd.pentester.com/search. And I'm not going to put these in the show links because I don't want people using them, but this is another site that asks for first name, last name, state, and birth year. If you have to use it, just try putting a different birth year and see if you get a result. I don't think the search on that site is particularly accurate, so you may just get a list of records anyway. Now, the actual data breach itself is still available on breach sites. I won't put links in the show notes for this or even mention the site names because I don't want any legal repercussions, but they are available, and there's even a torrent of the breach itself. It comes in 2 files, they're 7-zip files, and it expands to around 277 gig in size. I don't know if that is the full breach or just a portion of it. The actual zip size is 50 gig, so it's pretty well compressed. But if you do have it, this is how I would recommend searching it. If you try opening that up in Notepad or a text editor, you're probably going to end up crashing the app. It's not going to open such a large file. So there are 2 files in the breach, ssn.txt and ssn2.txt. Now, the 2 tools I would typically use to search massive text files like this are Ripgrep or AG, otherwise known as the Silver Searcher. Ripgrep is easy to install if you have Ubuntu Linux, for example. You just do sudo apt-get install Ripgrep, and then to use it, you type RG and then a single quote pattern. So you could type your surname, your last name, close quote, and then ssn.txt. Now, if your name is Smith, you're going to get results of Smith, Smithson, and all variations of it if it contains the word Smith. So you need to get creative with your searches. AG works in exactly the same way. It's very efficient. It's usually used for searching code. So again, install that with sudo apt-get install Silver Searcher -AG. And then to use it, it's AG and then single quote, search text, close quote, ssn.txt. You get the idea. And I think it's important that we know where our data has been leaked, which breaches they're part of, and to the extent of the information in there. Is there an old address, an old phone number? Do they have the correct information, and so on? Let's assume you find your information is part of this breach. I wouldn't panic. Hopefully by now you've already put a credit freeze across all the agencies. So Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. The other one I would recommend is the National Consumer Telecom and Utilities Exchange, NCTUE. I'll be honest, they don't make it entirely easy. As you know, I have an always-on VPN. And a lot of these sites do not like VPNs. You will have trouble logging in and various issues there. So you might have to use your real IP address to access the site, or play with different VPN providers and see if you have luck that way. But at least for yourself, you can do that online. I'm going to put links in the show notes for those agencies. One thing I would not dismiss is your kids. If you have kids, you need to freeze their credit too. Unfortunately, none of these credit agencies make it easy to freeze the credit for your kids. So Experian, let's start with them. They require you to use a form and send it in through mail. Now, they have a web page which is www.experian.com/help/minor-request.html. If you go there, they will say you need copies of your government issued ID, so US passport, for example, a piece of mail that shows your current address, such as a utility bill, insurance, bank statement, for example, a child's birth certificate, and your child's social security card. Now, these are copies. Do not send originals. But in addition, they want to know your full name as the parent, your social security number, date of birth, and a list of home addresses for the past 2 years. Now, I would send that with tracked mail. Make sure they have to sign for it. This is a lot of personal information that you have to send about yourself and your child just to freeze the credit. It really does bother me that they make it so difficult. So then TransUnion, they don't make it easy. They want you to put in a written request to place a protected consumer freeze, and they've put that in quotes, so make sure you have that on the letter on the named individual's file. They want one piece of information from the following: an order issued by a court of law, a lawfully executed and valid power of attorney, or, and this is probably going to apply to most of you, a document issued by federal, state or local government agencies in the United States showing proof of parentage, including a birth certificate. This seemed a bit strange, so I called them and said, okay, what if you have a child that was born outside of the United States? And they said, that's fine, just send it in anyway. If we don't like it, we'll send it back. I said, but can you not tell me now? Over the phone, I want to get this right. They said, yeah, a birth certificate should be fine. And then in addition to that, they want copies of documentation confirming your identity and the identity of the minor. So copy of the social security card, birth certificate, and so on. And then they want you to mail all of that to an address. Again, I'll put the link to that page in the show notes. Okay, and then there's Equifax. Again, they want this to be sent in the mail. And it says here, and I'm going to read straight from their site, you'll need to provide copies of documentation that verify your identity, the minor dependent's identity, and your relationship. So they want a copy of your driving license or other government-issued ID, a copy of a social security card, and your birth certificate. To prove you are the child's parent or authorised representative, provide one of the following: a copy of the child's birth certificate or a court order, a lawfully executed valid power of attorney, or a copy of foster care certification. At least they make it a lot clearer. And then they say to validate the child's identity, provide copies of both the following: a copy of the social security card and a copy of the child's birth certificate. Now, what's crazy is you do not have to provide all of that information to take out credit in someone's name. A lot of the publicly available data that's already out there and exposed on us on the internet, along with the social security number, can be used to take out a bank loan or a mortgage or a credit card. Why do they have to make it so difficult to freeze the credit? If a fraudster wants to freeze my credit for me, great. I want it to be difficult to unfreeze it, but to freeze it, again, I think this should be done by default. It really does bother me. Now, when I saw some news reports on this breach, it was quite interesting the advice they were giving. Freezing the credit was one piece of advice, which is great. I agree with that. But then they're telling everyone to change all of their passwords. I don't think you need to do that for this breach. This has got nothing to do with password hashes or passwords being exposed. It's good practice to have your passwords changed regularly anyway. But if, like me, you have just hundreds and hundreds of unique passwords with a password manager, then I certainly would not go through every single site changing my password because of this. This breach is completely unrelated. One thing to mention before I go is I've created a small, lightweight app written in Go called ElevenTray. If you are running Windows 11, I'm going to do a full show on this because Windows 11, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, is a bit of a privacy nightmare. Well, more than a bit of, it is a privacy nightmare. So there are a lot of things I would recommend you do to lock that down. Now, one of the annoyances, not so much a privacy issue, but just a minor annoyance, was by default, Windows 11 hides system tray icons. Now, if I'm installing software and it adds a system tray icon, I want to know about it. There was a workaround. You could edit the registry and basically enable the old setting, always show all system icons in the taskbar, but that no longer works. So you would end up with any icons going into that little arrow. You have to click on it to see what's in there. I don't want that. I need to see everything all at once. Maybe it's OCD, maybe it's something else, but that was a minor annoyance. This program I've created is open source. You can check out the source code. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's on my GitHub. LockSec is my GitHub username. and it's obviously only for Windows 11, but basically what it does, it monitors the registry for any system tray icons, and if they're hidden, it unhides them. And basically it runs as a process in the background called ElevenTray.exe and just sits there quietly. Now, I mentioned earlier about being skeptical and using critical thinking. Just because a program is open source does not mean it is secure. So if you are capable, I would go to GitHub, look at the source code that I've written in Go, scrutinize it, take a look. This was more of a tool that I needed for myself, for my own sanity, and I thought I would share that with everyone else. So if you find that useful, feel free to check it out. Now, overall, my advice would be don't upgrade to Windows 11. It's not going to give you anything more unless there's something really specific you need. But I can't think of anything. Windows 10 does just fine. But listen, if you can run Ubuntu Linux, or any variation of Linux, to be honest, that's going to be far better for you. Unfortunately for me, I am still tied into a few Windows apps that I need to run. And they do need direct access to hardware, which I cannot do without latency in a virtual machine. I'm sure there's a way of passing that through, but I'm going to incur latency. And with music production software and video editing that I use, I need to have the native apps installed. So, sucks for me. With that, as always, feel free to write in to lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. Feel free to share your privacy adventures, any concerns, anything you'd like me to cover on a future episode. I am trying to line up a few guests. I'm still waiting to pin down some dates. But until then, take your privacy one step at a time and you will get there eventually. Talk soon.